Hi, I'm Rob the Fresh Radio Burgess, and this is the 80s Rewind Show podcast. Thank you for joining me on today's show. I've got a fantastic guest for you. I've got Clark Datchler from Johnny Hates Jazz, and we discuss such songs as I Don't Want to Be a Hero and Shattered Dreams. Please like and subscribe, and if you go to the website address listed below, you'll get exclusive content you can only get on the website. Some artists have sent me some tracks that you can only hear at www.the80spod.com, the 80s Rewind Show podcast website. So please check it out. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you on the next one.
Here we go.
Hey, I'm Jack Hughes from Wang Chung.
Hey everybody, this is Ivan from Men Without Hats.
Hello everybody, this is Francis Dunnery from It Bites.
Hi everyone, this is Andy from Modern Romance.
Hi everyone, this is Charlene.
Hi, this is Dennis Seaton from Music EU.
Hi, I'm Nick Hayward.
Hi, this is Kevin from Fiction Factory.
And you're listening to the 80s Rewind Show podcast.
If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
It's time to bring you yet another amazing episode. And now, welcome your host,
Rob, the face for Radio Burgess.
Enjoy the show.
So normally I start by saying, was your parents musical? But your dad was a musician, wasn't he? Was he in the Stargazers first and then the Polka Dots? Is that right?
That's right. The Stargazers were a band of some repute. I mean, so were the Polka Dots, but the Stargazers were the first British band to have a #1 hit on the UK chart. Wow. The artist before that had been from the US, and the Stargazers went on to have other #1 hits, and they had their own BBC radio show, which is the equivalent of having the Graham Norton show now. I mean, it being belonging to the Stargazers. You know, they were really big stars of the day. But my dad wasn't really happy with the musical direction. It goes all the way back to then. This is like the 1950s. So the same problems that all musicians have eventually. And so he quit this incredibly successful band to join a new band called Polka Dots, who went on to win umpteen jazz vocalist awards, jazz vocal group awards. That's what they were. But then my dad was a sax and clarinet player as well. Great player. And they recorded with the Beatles, with young Jimmy Page, with, more importantly, for them, Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Joe Stafford, Peggy Lee. They were real proper jazzers. And so I grew up in a house, ironically, absolutely full to the brim of jazz. It's in my veins. I mean, it's you know, the name Johnny Hates Jazz was completely accidental and never meant to cause offense, even though it did in the long No, I mean, I've still got my dad passed away in '98, but I've still got his vinyl records of Nat King Cole and Oscar Peterson and Sinatra, obviously, and Duke Ellington. And, you know, I'm well into it.
That's wonderful. And your dad was he worked on some Beatles sessions. He was on the Long and Winding Road. Was he singing on that, or was he playing an instrument?
No, he was singing on the Long and Winding Road. This is what I heard. Right. I know for sure that he sang on I Am the Walrus in some of the really quirky stuff. And he told me a bit about that because my dad had an interesting story. You know, they were start of the 50s and early 60s, and the rise of rock and roll led by the Beatles really put the jazz world out of business for a while, for quite a long while. So he had a bittersweet relationship with the Beatles. And it took many years for him to come to terms with, especially Lennon and McCartney's ability as writers. I think it was when Ella Fitzgerald covered Can't Buy Me Love and Sinatra covered Yesterday that he started to think again. And also, more importantly, many a animated discussion with his youngest son, who was a huge Beatles fan. And I don't think when I was young that I fully understood the pain he must have felt of, I mean, it'd be the same as someone talking to me about how brilliant Take That were. But that whole generation of boy bands and girl bands brought an end to the 80s.
Yeah.
So I have my own issues with that, and I understand. It's my way of understanding how he must have felt. Sorry, that was a very long-winded.
No, I love it. So were you like influenced by your dad's records as a youngster, or was it your own collection that really made you turn your head and say, right, music's my thing, just like my dad, I love it?
Both, and probably the same for you, Robbie. You know, it's the music that we grew up as vinyl kids, so you didn't have access to anything and everything any hour of the day. It was a very special thing to have access to, let alone buy a vinyl record. So I was exposed to my dad's record collection, which, like I said, was jazz and classical. He was a big fan of Ravel and Debussy. All the jazzers were, so they are still my favorite composers, the French Impressionist composers. And then my brothers were really into soul and funk and reggae. So
awesome.
Yeah, so I was very much exposed to all manner of music. And I think that the things that really landed for me were the Isley Brothers, who were still, I think, one of the greatest bands in the world, really, really underrated for some strange reason. Earth, Wind and Fire, without a doubt.
Oh, yeah.
And Stevie Wonder, you know, he was my hero, along with then my own discoveries, which were very much in the rock realm. I was the rock kid, but I was not tribal musically. I think there always was tribalism, and there still is. I was not like that. I didn't care what genre it was from. If it was a good record or a good song, I was into it. Simple as that. I mean, I loved ABBA, but at the same time I loved the Sex Pistols, and I ended up in a band with one of the Sex Pistols. So it's like, but to me there was weirdly, the guy I was in the band with, Glenn Matlock, who was one of the original Pistols, was also into ABBA.
He was, yeah.
So there's a great irony in that. I think amongst musicians, we all kind of just like whatever we feel is good.
Yeah, you've got the music that you love and the music you front, if you like, isn't it? Like,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So if you had to pick an album that was a turning point for you, do you know which album that would be?
I think there were many albums that were turning points. It's so difficult to say one, but when I was young, it would have been when I finally heard, because I was born in '64, so I wasn't aware of when some of the earlier Beatles were recorded. I found that out, you know, right at the end of the '60s, beginning of the '70s. But Rubber Soul, yeah, I think, was the one that did it for me, the Beatles' Rubber Soul, because that had, I mean, I love the album, as I love Revolver and, you know, Magical Mystery Tour and the White Album especially, and Abbey Road actually, and all of them. But that album had a song on it called Nowhere Man,
yeah,
which Lennon said in retrospect he thinks was about himself.
Mm.
And I was really touched by that because I understood the message really clearly. I came from suburban London, and I think my greatest fear was disappearing, was just not being not important to the world, but important to myself first and foremost.
Yeah.
And I love the record. I love the actual recording is unbelievably brilliant. It's the turning point for me of the Beatles from, you know, earlier Beatles, which I think is still great, to what became this incredibly adventurous and experimental and influential Beatles of the later '60s. And it just had it all for me. And very quickly, as an aside, my dad used to sit me down and listen to jazz records and get me to click along with the record, because for jazz, they were really into this concept of swing.
Right.
So you hear a lot of people do jazz now. Sorry, I'm doing a quotation. You know, you see at the Royal Albert Hall, they do kind of a, you know, jazz evening with the London Philharmonic, and these jazz singers come on, and it doesn't swing. There's no feel to it. They're really capable singers and a brilliant orchestra, but they just don't connect in that way. But when you hear Nowhere Man, and this is true of early rock and roll, Bill Haley as an example, they really swing still. The influence of jazz is still there subliminally. And Ringo's playing on Nowhere Man is just so cool. I know everyone talks about it now. After years of him being, you know, put down, he is actually one of the greatest drummers ever. His feel is phenomenal. Anyway.
You're absolutely right. It's a fantastic album. It's a very sparse album as well. It hasn't got loads of overdubs. It's very sparse. I think that's
it's still them kind of, you know, I'm sure it wasn't around one microphone in the studio like the early stuff, but it still feels a bit like that.
It's wonderful. And you're right. I mean, for me, it's probably Rubber Soul, Revolver, and then straight to Abbey Road. I think if I had to pick three to Desert Island, it would be those three. Funny enough, I'm named after a song on Revolver, Dr. Robert. So.
Oh, how cool. What a great record. Very cool.
You can't, cool. About a dentist that gave me LSD, but there we are. My dad was funny. That's great. So were you sort of getting into songwriting at this early period as well? Were you sort of thinking about songs and constructing songs as well?
Yeah, I wrote my first song, I think, when I was 8. So certainly I made a note in my diary, which I used to keep back then, which said, one day I'm going to be a successful musician like my dad. And so I started writing at that point. I mean, it was really basic stuff. I would never let anyone hear it. I don't think anyone could hear it because there's no means to record it back then. I think what I really got from the Beatles especially was this concept, and this is what was revolutionary about the Beatles and the Kinks and the Moody Blues and the Who and the bands of that time, was that they wrote their own material. We've got to remember that before that, there were writers and performers.
Yeah.
And even Burt Bacharach and Hal David, who I grew up listening to and love, was still in that kind of realm. And so that's all I wanted to do. I didn't want to write for other people. Why would I want to? Why would I want to do that?
Yeah.
I tried that a little bit in the earlier 2000s with these big writing teams when they write for other people. In fact, I wrote with Take That.
Wow.
And it was an awful experience. I just don't, I'm not interested. I want to, if I can't express it myself, then it's meaningless to me. So it has to connect with me. And this is why, I think the Beatles were so, Lennon and McCartney was so important, and George Harrison, was that they were able to not just do it for themselves, but demonstrate it to a younger generation, you know. And we all thought, I remember Sting saying this in an interview recently, you know, that we all thought, I could do that with it, you know, with enough talent and enough, hopefully talent anyway, and a degree of luck and all the rest of it and happenstance. And I started writing pretty early.
I mean, when you think about it as well, that would be the 60s version of the Sex Pistols. You know, they came along, gave a "we can do it" ethos, and then there was bands everywhere.
Totally. And what was really weird about the emergence of punk was that it disappeared so quickly. You know, whereas rock and roll, 60s rock and roll, continued and evolved, and you could argue that punk became new romantics and all the rest of it. I think that's very tenuous. But I think an important thing is when rock and roll emerged, it didn't try and destroy in reputation that which came before it. It was just doing its own thing. Whereas punk was gave great emphasis on putting down the likes of prog rock, and I think that was a massive mistake. It was enough in and of itself. I know it was all about attitude, and that was a big part of it, but the attitude about bringing down the establishment. I mean, I think Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen are absolutely brilliant songs. That was enough. That was a big enough message. You didn't have to, you know, put down Genesis at the time. Genesis are brilliant. You know, it's like this is what I didn't get. So anyway, that's my feeling. That's where the similarity ends.
That's it. You can't be a Pink Floyd fan back then.
No, and you should have been. You should have been if you were into the Pistols or, you know, whoever, the Jam, early Jam. You should have been into Pink Floyd because they were so related.
They're just amazing. So did you go to piano or guitar first, or was it straight to singing, or what instrument sort of inspired you first?
It was guitar first. And my dad, when he got out of the music business, when he was forced out by the rise of rock and roll, he got into another business, and in that business, he found, I mean, literally found a guitar under a bed.
Wow.
He wasn't repossessing anyone, anything like that. He wasn't, but he was involved in property, and someone had vacated a property, and they'd literally left a guitar under the bed, and he brought it home, knowing because the property had to be, you know, vacated. And he said, you know, look, I found this. So it was actually two guitars. It was an electric, very inexpensive electric, and a very old acoustic. And he said, I found these, you know, you can play them, but if they're claimed within 3 months, they're going, you know, and I understood that. But I took the electric and I raced upstairs and I put it under my bed, my own bed, you know, and that was my ticket. You know, I started to teach myself to play guitar. And they weren't ever claimed, so I've still got that guitar. And it's in the attic now. It needs to be completely overhauled. But I learned on guitar, and my dad paid for me to have piano lessons at school,
Right.
and I was useless. I was, I mean, I failed my piano. I was at my music O level. I was, and so to teach me music, the piano teacher, when he realized I wasn't going anywhere, suggested I learn flute, which is one line of music, much easier. So I did learn flute, and that did help me understand some theory. Right. But guitar was my thing, and it was not until later that I took up piano by just teaching myself. When I could teach myself, like on guitar, I conceptualized it much better, and I became a keyboard player. That's my main thing now.
That's crazy. What a turnaround.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a guitar here. You won't be able to see this. I just bought a new guitar because I haven't owned a guitar for a long time. So I'm going to kind of reacquaint myself, because I played some guitar on the Turn Back the Clock album. I play guitar on Don't Let It End This Way.
I mean,
so I'm still playing at that point.
That's beautiful. People listening, is that a blue Les Paul you got there?
It's a blue Les Paul. It's not a Gibson. It's an Epiphone, which is a less expensive.
But they're the cool ones.
Yeah, the Epiphones are great, actually. They're really
So when did you start gigging? When did you sort of start putting yourself on stage and getting out there and actually trying to perform?
Well, I first did it when I left school. I left school at 16. My dad said, you can leave school at 16, which I desperately wanted to do, providing you get 5 O levels. So I got 5 O levels. That was my only focus. 5 O, no more. Just get out.
Yeah.
And then I spent like 3 months at a Polytechnic college, and then I quit that. And in that 3 months, I did my first performance in the theatre there. But really, my first proper performance came when I released my first single when I was 17. I'd written this song when I was 16, called You Fooled Him Once Again. And that came out on an indie label in London. And my first performance was at the Lyceum Ballroom. It was big. There were a lot of people there, and I did a PA where I sang to the backing track. And there was another singer who supported me on that record called Juliet Roberts, who was from a band called Working Week, a jazz funk band. I was in the jazz funk world, I should say. That was my thing.
Right.
Same world, the same British jazz funk world that Level 42 came out of, and Imagination and Lynx and Freeze, and that was my world. Which was kind of an edgy jazz funk. It was British. It was a rough around the edges. I really liked it. And so Juliet Roberts was from that world as well. She did backing vocals, and she was on stage with me, which was a relief because I was very nervous. And the stage was flooded by the audience at the end of it. Young people, especially young ladies, wanting my autograph. I didn't know what to do. I was not, hey, I've made it now. No, I was totally unconfident, and the record company boss at the time, Billy Russell, passed away now, thrust a bunch of photographs of me in my hand and said, sign them. And I looked at him and I said, what now? He said, yes, now. He thrust me into the crowd, and that was my first experience. So it was a very illuminating.
I've heard your single, that first single. It's on YouTube, and I had to listen to it. And is it right? You was influenced by Bobby Caldwell.
Bobby Caldwell.
Caldwell, sorry. Yeah.
Yes,
and it was the song "What You Won't Do for Love," which I listened to, which I thought was the sort of closest to that song. And then when I heard that song by Bobby Caldwell, I thought, I know that song straight away. It popped in my head. I knew it. And then I thought, who does it sound like? It reminds me of George Benson and Boz Scaggs at the same time.
Oh, interesting. And I was into both of them. Well, so that you're musically educated, Robbie, to make that comparison, which is absolutely true. And Caldwell is a guitarist, and like George Benson, and the kind of the thing that Boz Scaggs had with Low Down, and Michael McDonald had with the Doobies, and then his own stuff, was very was influencing me very much, and I wanted to be in that world, really. And in actual fact, if I may mention this, I do a live stream every 2 weeks called Journey Songs. I've been doing it since lockdown. It's on my own YouTube and Facebook channels, Clark Datchler Official. And the last one I did was actually all about You Fooled Him Once Again. So I tell the whole story there of how it came to be. But it's actually the where you can hear it now. You can stream it on an album called Funk Classics Volume 1.
Wow.
And when I found it on there, I was, because I'd lost track of the record. I don't own it or anything. It's, you know, it was a different era where you sign your life away when you do a record. And when I found it on Funk Classics next to some really cool R&B and funk tracks, I was really touched because only the people who compiled the album would have heard it and said it belongs on there. I didn't write to anyone saying, yeah, this is a funk classic, or so. I just didn't know, you know. And so it was really, I'm glad it kind of hit home. I'm glad it hit home that it's landed in that world.
So was it signed to Bluebird Records at the time? Is that the one that?
Yeah, Bluebird Music, the publisher. Blue Ink Records was the label, and it was a little record store just off the Edgware Road in London that dealt in import soul and reggae. And they released a few records, and I was one of them. And it was a really weird world and lovely world for me, because you walked into their offices and it was a record store, and you know, it was full of you know, R&B fans and rastas, and you know, everyone there listening to music as you did in a record store back then, as you remember, Robbie. You'd go in there and they'd be actually playing the music, or you could ask them to put on a record so you could see if you liked it. And so it was a very tangible experience in a record store. And then upstairs with the little label. And when you sign a record deal, this is certainly how it was in the past, you get an advanced payment to keep you going. And then you have to pay that back from the royalties you make from your record. And my advance payment was £1.
That's fantastic.
If the label was tiny, they didn't have money to give me, you know, something to keep going. I had to continue to do the jobs I was doing back then, which is working in record stores, actually. So that was my introduction.
If only more record companies run that way, you know, from a record shop, so they know what people actually want to buy.
Totally. You know what? There's a lot to be said for that. And that's a really interesting idea. Whether that will happen again, we'll have to see.
And is this where you met Rusty Egan? Does Rusty Egan come into your story at this point?
Yeah, so Rusty heard You Fooled Him Once Again, thanks to one of my brothers, Ash, who worked in a very high fashion store on the King's Road. The King's Road was the fashion street back in the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s. And this was early 80s, 81. And Rusty was in Visage and had been in a band called the Rich Kids, also with Midure. And interestingly, with Guy Matlock, who I, you know, ended up in a band with again. Ash played Rusty, You Fooled Him Once Again, and Rusty was beginning to produce people. And he really liked it, thought I had promise. And so he kind of took me under his wing, and he introduced me to electronic music. And so and he loved the fact I was into soul music. Like a lot of the electronic artists of the 80s, they will describe themselves as soul boys, Spandau especially, you know, but we all were. But interestingly, musically, you rarely get that. But Rusty, you know, did some recording with me at Trident Studios, where he was based. And I did more performances, you know, through him. Camden Palace, which is now Coco's, and other places. And that led directly to going to LA for a brief time. I was a songwriter out there, as you can imagine, as from what I said earlier.
Yeah.
I loved being in LA. It was great as a, you know, young lad, 17, 18-year-old guy, but writing for other people. And I wrote for Martha Reeves and the Drifters, and it just wasn't my thing.
Wow.
So I came back and, you know, I was still signed to Rusty and answered an advertisement in the Melody Maker, which to anyone watching who doesn't remember, and you should remember, was a music-specific newspaper, like the Enemy and Sounds were, Such Times. And that's where you looked in the classified ads at the back to see if you could join a band. And there was an advertisement for a singer needed for a band that was signed to a major label. Well, that was music to my ears, quite literally. Didn't know what it was. And I didn't think I was much of a singer. I was a better songwriter. I was a songwriter who sang, and I still am, as far as I'm concerned. But I answered the advertisement. I sent in this recording I'd done with Rusty, which was this kind of electronic funk record. And they heard it and they liked me. And that was my introduction to RAK Records, which is Mickey Most's label. Mickey Most, who was until recently the most successful producer of all time.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah. And I signed with, and I joined a band called Hot Club, and Hot Club had Glenn in it, Glenn Matlock, and James Stevenson from Chelsea and Generation X, and Gene Loves Jezebel later, and Calvin Hayes, who was the drummer in the band, Mickey's son, and eventually a founder member along with myself and Mike Nacito and Johnny Hates Jazz. So it was all kind of one singular path.
So was it right Mike was working at RAK at the time?
Mike was an engineer, young engineer. He eventually became chief engineer. Mike's from the States, although he was born in Germany and grew up in England. He's very American still, in his accent and some of his outlook, which is very cool. And Mickey, basically, when I'd been in Hot Club, we'd released a record, and Mickey had agreed to give me a solo deal as well. He suggested I start doing my demo recordings at RAK with a young engineer called Mike Nacito. And it would help me and it would help him because it give him experience. And me and Mike bonded very quickly. So I did loads of demos, a couple of singles on RAK that Mickey produced. Didn't really get anywhere, but unbeknownst to me, I mean, I still knew Calvin because Calvin and I had been in Hot Club.
Yeah.
But Calvin and Mike had started working together as a production team. So there I was, writing my own music and recording it. And Mike and Calvin were beginning to experiment with their own productions. And then, one thing led to another. And they started working on a record called Me and My Foolish Heart with another RAK engineer. Actually, he was a chief engineer for a long time, Phil Thornalley. And Phil ended up being in The Cure for a while and then becoming a songwriter in his own right. Successful songwriter.
Yeah.
And a producer. He produced Prefab Sprout, the album with When Love Breaks Down on it. And so he was, he was an achiever.
Yeah.
But Phil also wanted to be an artist. And so they had worked on this song, Me and My Foolish Heart, just for a short while. And Phil, never really saw himself as part of the band, and he was doing other things. And so Mike and Calvin thought, well, they needed another singer. And again, I was someone who never thought of myself as a singer. Well, ironically, about 6 weeks before, RAK had been taken over by a German guy, not in ownership, but in terms of day-to-day running. And he didn't think I was earning my keep. So he terminated my agreement, which was a really depressing moment.
Yeah. So
ironically, as I left the building, I could hear Mike and Calvin working on Me and My Foolish Heart. And I went and I said, guys, what's that? I was ashen faced. So they said, what's up? And I said, this is what's happened. And they were shocked because I knew that.
Yeah.
And I said, what are you working on? They said, this track, Me and My Foolish Heart, working on it with Phil. And I said, that sounds good. And weirdly, I said, if you ever need another singer on it, you know where I am. I don't know why I said that. 6 weeks later, they call me up. Clark, Phil doesn't want to do this. We've barely got a vocal on here. It was just a rough guide. Do you want to give it a go? So I went in and it worked. And Foolish Heart came out as a single on RAK. Wasn't a success. But there's something about the collaboration and the sound that I thought, I'm going to give this a go. So I said to Mike and Calvin, let me go away, write a few songs for Johnny Hates Jazz. Let's see what we come up with, or I come up with. And so the first song I came up with was Shattered Dreams. And that was very much my way of what I brought to the table in combination with what we had achieved sonically with Johnny Hates Jazz with Me and My Foolish Heart.
Yeah.
So that was that. You asked me one question, it's set in one time, and I took you all the way to 1986, which is when we
I love it. I love it. Do you think like Shattered Dreams would have been written if you hadn't just been sacked and stuff like that? Was it one of those things where you had it on your mind when you were writing?
Well, it's a great question. Probably it might have done, because I was very influenced by the music of the time. Like, I was a young guy, very much plugged into what was happening, which is true of all the young artists today. They're plugged into the now. They won't in the future.
Mhm.
They will become the older artists, and they will deal with that. But I was really, I was in the thick of it, and so maybe Shattered Dreams would have come about. But you know what? There's there's an interesting thing when you're making music. It's really, I've always found it good to know what you're writing for.
Yeah.
You kind of, it's not just, it's a lovely thing to say, I just want to express myself. But music's about communication. So you want to feel that there's an idea behind how we're going to get it to people. It's not, that's not me kind of trying to, gild the lily of the idea of just selling records and making money. That was way down the list for me.
Mm.
I wanted to survive, but I wanted to be recognized and communicate with people. That was a really big thing. So the idea that, the three of us said, let's keep this going. Let's give it another go after Me and My Foolish Heart was, does give you a sense of forward motion and momentum. I think if I just left the label as I did, I would have needed to find another avenue.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that would have been.
So you went away and wrote a bunch of songs. How did Shattered Dreams come about? Was it lyrics first? Was it melody first? Did it all sort of just click, or was it a dream and you wrote it down? How did it work?
No, which is interesting how that does happen.
Yeah.
I wrote it in this room, and
wow.
I wrote it on a piano, which is over there, which you can't see. It's still there. I've got my old Steinway next to me, my Steinway Grand, which has been with me many years. But the piano I learned on, my Kemble, my mom and dad's Kemble, is still over there. I'm actually looking after my mom now in her older age. So I've set up a studio in the room where I used to have a rudimentary recording setup as a kid.
Wow.
So it's full of vibes and memories here. So Shattered Dreams, I was writing it on the piano over there, and my dad came in, and he didn't used to do this. He always gave me space. We talked a lot about music, and he guided me when he felt it was appropriate. But he came in, he said, "What's that you're working on?" I said, "It's called Shattered Dreams, Dad." And he went quiet and he said, "I think you've written your first hit."
Wow.
And you know what? Most people in the music business, once they heard it, said it was going to die a death. It was going to crash. Didn't stand a chance. Even Mickey Most, who was a great supporter of mine, didn't think it was going to do anything. So I did a demo of it on my, rudimentary recording setup, 4-track cassette recorder. I had one synthesizer, which was a Casio. Still got it. It needs to be repaired. CZ 1000. That ended up on all of Turn Back the Clock, the record, throughout. That keyboard is now revered. And the music, it typically, it's like, ABBA at the time was scorned by, the serious music fans, and now they're uplifted. Oh yes, of course, Benny and Bjorn, fantastic writers. I never thought at the time, but I did. So Casios are like that. Sorry, that's a bit of an aside. And then we did our own demo, the band, up at RAK, and actually, is that right? Yes, we did. And anyway, what we decided to do was to see if we should go with a label that really wanted to support this, because Mickey didn't feel we were going to do it with Shattered Dreams. So we organized an acoustic show at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club, which we thought was very clever of us, being called Johnny Hates Jazz.
Nice.
And we invited labels to come and see us at it was lunchtime in the week, and 2 labels came. In other words, 2 people.
Right.
And Ronnie Scott's is not a small place.
It's not. No.
One of them was from a label I don't remember, and another was from a label called Virgin Records. And there we were doing an acoustic rendition of the songs of Me and My Foolish Heart, but specifically the songs that I'd written at that time: Shattered Dreams, Turn Back the Clock, I Don't Want to Be a Hero, Don't Say It to Love was one of the first ones. And the guy from the other label got up and left halfway through, which was really soul destroying. One person left, but that person stayed until the end. And his name was John Wooler. And in all honesty, John was encouraged to come by someone called Caroline True, who worked at Virgin and was a friend of ours.
Right.
And ended up being George Michael's right-hand person. She's now an incredible photographer, actually, in her own right. And John liked us. And we liked John as well. We got on very well immediately. And John said, let me play this to my superiors, because he was a junior A&R man at that time. And they didn't really get it.
Right.
They didn't get it. So John said, look, can you at least come and see them, do another performance? So my dad actually organized a studio for us in London to do this in. And Mike couldn't make it. He was an engineer at RAK Studios. He had to, work when he was told to work. So it was just me and Calvin. And John Wooler came with a guy called Jeremy LaSalle's and someone else from Virgin. Jeremy LaSalle's was the senior A&R man. And they sat and listened to us, and there was deathly silence in between each song. Or sometimes they would stop us halfway through and say, could we hear another one?
Wow. Brutal.
And brutal, yeah. And actually at the end of that, thanks partly to John's insistence and Caroline True's insistence, they signed us on a singles deal.
Right.
They didn't believe we would ever make it to an album. It was really I think in part it was a way to shut John and Caroline up, to just give us this singles deal, not spend any money on it of any note. We were ensconced at RAK, and Mickey most still allowed us to work there for next to nothing, if not nothing, which was so good of him.
Amazing.
And so we recorded Shattered Dreams, and it came out. It was released as a single, and in spring of 1987. And it took a long time to get into the top 40. We had to really persevere in different ways to get it into the top 40, which you had to do in order to get to force radio on to play it, force them to playlist it. Because we were just getting what's called spot plays before, play here and a play there. And we went around the country. We promoted as much as we could. It was a different time then. There was no internet, of course. You were very much radio dependent. TV was a luxury. And we did a video, which we didn't like at the time. We really didn't like it. And fortunately, it made it into the top 40. And at that point, the public could hear it. And the public could hear it because Radio 1 had to play it, whether they liked it or not. Unfortunately, some of the DJs really championed us. There were some people who really did. Mike Reed, Peter Powell, Gary Davis were, real supporters, and David Jensen, actually. And the public decided they wanted it. They liked it. And it kept going up. In the UK, it stayed at number 5 for 3 weeks, which probably doesn't sound these days, like a big achievement, because everything's about number 1. Of course it was then as well. But Shattered Dreams, what was different about Shattered Dreams compared to a lot of our peers who were new bands of that time is that it just caught fire all around the world.
It did, yeah.
It became a bigger hit in many other countries than it was in Britain. And then I Don't Want to Be a Hero followed it up and became a bigger hit in some countries than Shattered Dreams, unbeknownst to the UK. And then Turn Back the Clock, the same thing. In some countries, it was a number 1. In the UK, it got to 11. It was our Christmas single. It got to 11. And although it's now a really well-known song, over the years, it's become really well-known. It was a massive hit in some of the Scandinavian countries. And so there you go.
That's great. As a songwriter and a musician, obviously your early influences were sort of funk and soul. Was it a difficult transition for you to go over to this sort of pop music? Was you happy with the transition, or was it the direction you were just going at the time and you didn't mind? Or
So it was a very easy transition, and the transition was simplified by a couple of facts. One, I was a keyboard player by that time, so I was well into synths. And I liked, Fade to Grey that Rusty was part of. I was really into, to cut a long story short, I really was didn't really get into Spandau after that, but that was like, proper where I thought it was at. But the record that did it for me was Love on Your Side by the Thompson Twins.
Yeah.
And because I could hear the soul element in it, the groove was totally that. And I really, really, again, I didn't really love the Thompson Twins after that. Although I bought Doctor Doctor, I think, and it wasn't the same. Love on Your Side was it. It was great. I still regard that as one of the greatest records.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And Tom, who recorded at RAK a lot, and Mike worked with as a young engineer, really, I think has been incredibly influential. He's a tremendous keyboard player, a tremendous producer and mind in that world. So it was easy. To me, it was like, that was the bridge. It was like, oh, I get it. I can still be me, but with synths and drum machines. Great. Yeah.
I mean, what's wonderful is obviously the music's been going for, it's creeping up to 40 years, let's be honest. Yeah. But recently, last year, you released Shattered Dreams for the Ukraine, which is a wonderful version of your song. I'm going to put a donation link in the show notes below, by the way, where anyone that's listening, no problem, to the iPod version or the video, just give it a click and donate there. That's a wonderful version of those songs. And I was thinking about it as a concept wider than that as well. And I was thinking about I Don't Want to Be a Hero. And I was thinking about the Russian people fighting in a war they don't want to fight.
There's a lot of people have made that connection, said, why don't you do something, etc.
Yeah.
And I just don't think they're going to hear it. I think that's the problem. And really, they need to hear it. And because a lot of them feel that way, without a doubt. And the irony of this is that, that in the genre that is now called synthwave, which essentially is 80s inspired, music of the present, or the past 10, 20 years, some of the best bands of the synthwave movement have come out of Russia. I mean, there's a band called Tesla Boy who've been around for a long time. They're really, really good. And, in this wonderful day and age where, we're led to believe that music has been democratized, but actually the big corporations control it more than ever, you're never going to hear them. Yeah. Unless you stumble across them on, streaming sites. And so it'd be, I think there would be an absolute openness to hearing that record amongst a certain demographic in Russia. I think that for me, what I don't want to do is, music should be about bringing people together. So Shattered Dreams of Ukraine worked for me because it wasn't divisive. It was about dealing with a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
It could have been dedicated to what happened in Syria, in Yemen. I often feel that I should have done something for those conflicts. I was very involved in the environmental movement, so that was kind of where my focus was.
Yeah.
But I finally got around to something that was, to something that would benefit people who are victims of war. And you're right, Hero maybe will yet play a part. I'll have to think about that again now you've mentioned it.
I mean, yeah, Little Big are a fantastic Russian band. They went to represent Russia in the 2020 Eurovision, but unfortunately because of COVID they didn't perform. But they're a brilliant band. The videos are hilarious as well. If you get a chance to check them out.
I will. Yeah.
They're marvelous. So before we quickly go, I just talk about Johnny Songs 1, your last album came out. It's a great album. Really, really great. I was playing it the other day. Heart of Hearts, that is a fantastic track. It's really, really good. And it's very reminiscent of your Johnny H Jazz days as well. It's got a real flavor of the old days. Was that sort of intentional, or is it just the style now?
Well, Johnny Songs 1 is, I didn't put this on, you've probably streamed it. I didn't put it on the CD either, because it's available as a CD as well. But it's actually an amalgamation, a compilation of the solo recordings I did after I left Johnny Hates Jazz, because if you remember, I left quite quickly.
Yeah.
And so when I did an album called Rain Dance, I was still in Johnny Hates Jazz mode. I was the songwriter in the band, so I brought and the a lot of the sonic signature, though not all, because Mike and Calvin absolutely brought an enormous amount to it as producers, but some of the sonic signature was mine with what I did in my home studio. So I kind of brought that with me and made this album called Rain Dance, which I traveled the world to make, and involved some incredible musicians on it. A lot of the musicians who played with Michael Jackson were on that album.
Wow.
And so it was a very natural thing that a lot of it sounded like that. So there were a lot of recordings from that time, early 90s, that the world was changing. The 80s were over, and they were being ended very categorically, because the music industry needed to, or decided they were going to transition into what I thought was something that actually stemmed out of Stock Aitken Waterman. And that is where you have a group of people who make a record for a performer, and that performer fronts it, but they don't actually make the records.
Yeah.
They just sing on it. Well, that's become the norm now, the norm since then. And that's not to say everyone in the 90s did that, but it was the transition. And it was weird because basically I got caught up in that. It was like there wasn't an openness as there used to be, and there should have been, because I'd been very successful. So anyway, I put them all together on Journey Songs 1, remastered, etc. And Heart of Hearts was one of those songs where it should have been something. I'm convinced it should have been. Ironically, Virgin, who released Rain Dance, categorically wanted to release a song called Crown of Thorns as the single, and Crown of Thorns was an overt critique of religion, organized religion, excuse me. And I was amazed they chose that. I was really pleased, because I really liked the song, but it was, think about it. George Michael left Wham and came out with Careless Whisper, which is a beautiful record.
Yeah.
I came out with a song which is musically very strong, I think, Crown of Thorns, but lyrically, especially in the States, they weren't going to get on board with that. And I was oblivious to that. The part of me that wrote "I Don't Want to Be a Hero," just that's what I thought I wanted to do. That's what I grew up listening to. The Isleys, Stevie, Lennon and McCartney had something to say. They wanted to influence the world in their way, in the positive. So you did that through the lyrics you wrote. And I just went off on one. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, I got more environmental. All my solo stuff had a message.
Yeah.
So Journey Songs 1 is the 90s stuff, and then Journey Songs 2 is coming out. I'm actually working on it in my studio here. Journey Songs 2 is coming out as my recordings late 90s, early 2000s, before rejoining Johnny Hates Jazz, which I did in 2009. And that's got some really, really cool stuff on it. An album called Tomorrow, which I released in 2007, is an environmental album. But anyone who likes Johnny Hates Jazz, and people often say that when they hear it in my Journey Songs live stream, because I've been going through those songs recently, go, "Oh my goodness, that actually sounds quite Johnny Hates Jazz, but in a kind of a grown-up way." Well, yeah, that's what it is. So that's going to be a very cool album. And then following that, I rejoined, and me and Mike did an album called Magnetize, and then Wide Awake, and here we are.
Fantastic. So if people want to catch up with what you're doing, where's the best place to get you?
Well, the best place to find me is you can go to clarkdatchler.com, but I would say find me on YouTube, youtube.com/Clark Datchler Official, but especially Facebook is where, for some reason, I know Facebook seems a bit antiquated to some people these days, but facebook.com/Clark Datchler Official. And of course, you can find Johnny Hates Jazz at johnnyhatesjazz.com. But I'm really, really active on Facebook and on YouTube. So, if you want to reach out, I'm there and I will respond.
That's fantastic. Clark, thank you so much for chatting today. It's been amazing.
Thank you, Robbie. Great questions. Thank you, man.
Thanks for joining me on the 80s Rewind Show podcast and watching all the way to the end. If you can, like and subscribe, and please tell your friends and family all about the show. Don't forget to check out the rest of the content on the channel, and I'll see you on the next one.